Bonjour à tous et bienvenue dans cette
Welcome to this controversy called Wages Against Profit, an inevitable conflict. I'm Pauline Rossi, I teach economics at Polytechnique, and I will be moderating this debate. We have Mr. Frédéric Souillot, Secretary General of Force Ouvrière, the trade union, and Thibault, who is CEO of LUMINESS, the company. We'll begin our debate without further ado. I'd like to ask you what your position is, your general position on this very age-old question, which dates back to the beginning of capitalism and wage earning. Could you, in a few minutes, give us your views on the matter? And then subsequently, we'll talk more specifically about what you have in common and what differs between you. So, Mr. Souillot, you might begin. Is the conflict inevitable? And what are the best tools, according to you, to remedy the situation? Well, I think the conflict is always inevitable because on either side of the table, we have differing views. It's the contractual practice that we have set up, but collective bargaining has existed since 1936, and the conflict is inevitable. It's inevitable because if we sit down together at the same table and start to talk, it's with your salary that you buy a fridge. It's not with a bonus that you're going to do that kind of thing. So I think we need to revert to collective bargaining, which should occupy its rightful place. If it's the state that decides and imposes certain things, then the various parties concerned won't have their wishes fulfilled. The LANXADE law, the labor code, calls for consultation and then negotiation. But if you only negotiate on things where you're convinced that you'll reach an agreement in the end, that's meaningless. Also, the Republic has a system based on equal footing, and collective bargaining has led to social cohesion in our Republic. So you have employers and wage earners. They occupy an equally important place around the negotiating table when it comes to additional retirement schemes, Agir Arco. The idea is to have a fully transparent, parity-based system. You need full transparency because we're talking about billions and billions of euros. Salaries versus profit. Well, there shouldn't be a conflict if we negotiate and discuss. Mr. Dongsan, what's your proposal to fairly share out value? This is a conflict which is particularly French. When we talk about a salary versus profit, while people talk a lot about dividends, we're in the only country where dividends are problematical. And if we talk about salaries versus profit, people talk about equality. When it comes to sharing value, it's better to talk about an equitable solution because you have wages and then the sharing of value, which is linked to the results of the company. Frédéric said quite rightly, 50 years ago, General de Gaulle invented workers' participation, and a bit before, the Resistance Council set up an incentive scheme. 50 years later, we are renovating the system through an interprofessional agreement. The idea is to redefine incentives, worker participation, and the sharing of value, which is the third pillar. So this scheme will be transposed into law in October. The social partners have reached an agreement in January, and the government was asked to transpose this agreement faithfully into law. It redefines the objectives for an experimental period of 5 years. And the incentive scheme, participation, And the sharing of value will make it possible to correct or achieve a better sharing of value depending on the size of the company, the profits made, which is obviously very important. This is major headway, major progress, therefore. I don't want to shock Frédéric, of course, but not that long ago, certain trade unions didn't want to recognize incentives and workers' participation. They said there was a risk of cannibalizing wages, that certain amounts paid to employers don't finance this parity-based system, but the agreement was endorsed by all the big trade unions in the end. So therefore, we see that the usefulness of incentives and participation has been recognized. We have this new scheme, a premium for sharing value, and this will be applied experimentally for 5 years. Good. So there was recently a national interprofessional agreement on the sharing of values, and both of you participated and contributed to the discussions. We've understood that this is a major step forward. Do you view things in the same light? Well, the agreement, of course, enables smaller companies to be involved, but it's just a first step. Article 1 says that these bonuses should not replace wages, salaries, and it was a good idea to put this in writing. This will be transposed into law, and we want it to be transposed completely, fully. Some people wanted to make amendments that would have gone back to the discussion, but that's not the purpose. This draft agreement will be tabled in September, and all the parties on the employers and trade union side, we don't know what's going to happen. We didn't really want to enter into a state of conflict. We went into the second round of elections, and collective bargaining was deemed to be very important. It's what I was saying. If you choose only subjects where, in the end, we know we'll reach an agreement, then that doesn't make a negotiation that worthwhile. So we took this matter up. We had to explain to the government that the agenda of the negotiation was not a political one. It takes a bit more time to reach an agreement, of course. And then we reached an agreement signed by 4 trade unions and all the employers' unions. And it applies to all. The National Interprofessional Agreement says several things. The first thing, it recognizes that you need more equity. When a company has benefits, you have to distribute them better. And for distribution to be good, it should cover as many enterprises as possible. 4 million workers don't get incentives, don't participate in company shares. So now we can say to small and medium-sized companies, if you have net tax revenue of over 1% of your turnover for 3 consecutive years, then you have to pay out through a value sharing scheme. You have to pay out certain incentives. When a company gets super profits and it feels that these super profits are well-based, then it can up the incentive or the workers' participation. It's a gentle nudge because it's a unilateral position on the part of management, which will be judged on this basis for 5 years. The other point is that we consider that some enterprises will introduce value-sharing schemes. Some companies won't be able to do so. They won't be able to give free shares to the workers or other things linked to the company capital. If I can't open up my capital, I can't dilute it, I'm not listed, how can I ensure that wage earners benefit from the increase in value of the company? So this is a new scheme. It will be applied in steps over time, and the URSSAF, the national funds, will have to find the most effective way to ensure these schemes remain simple. The last point is also important. It's this sharing of value which needs to become perennial. For companies with fewer than 50 wage earners, it's possible to set up a rapid distribution scheme without any engagement in terms of incentive or participation. If companies need to recruit and boost customer loyalty, in small and medium-sized companies, these schemes can be very significant. That's an example of an agreement which you succeeded in signing. It doesn't always work, but it did this time around. There's an example of a disagreement, the upping of the minimum wage. For you, this is an important way of sharing value, whereas for you, Mr. LANXADE, it's not a very good idea. Could you please develop your views in this respect? Upping the minimum wage. We've been calling for this every year because of inflation. We ask that the minimum wage be upped, because the minimum wage is a minimum wage, as the name indicates, and it's simply not tolerable today that one, for one's whole life, receives the minimum wage. When you get the minimum wage, you can fill the fridge, but that's complicated as of the second part of the month, particularly when inflation is high. And what we say is that we must set up a mobile salary scale when you have inflation. Otherwise, we will be crushing salaries, the difference between various salaries, and as Thibault was saying, the attractiveness of professions will suffer. A lot of professions where people can't find people to hire, well, that's linked often to the initial wage, also conditions of work, and possible careers for the person concerned. When it comes to minimum wage, there should be no employers' social security payments as of 1.6 times the minimum wage. This shouldn't impact the welfare system. The state must compensate. So, in terms of the system, we need to have a parity-based system and these collective bargainings. First point, when you look at increases in wages for companies in 2023, the average increase is about 4.5. And when you look at things in greater depth, particularly the lower wages, in a lot of companies, increases were granted, and they are closer to 7, 7.5, or 8, depending on the size of the company. In 2023, purchasing power, in light of the inflation, has gone beyond inflation. Of course, we have the price of meat, the price of petrol, that creates discrepancies. But from a macroeconomic stance, companies did play the game, given the demand to increase purchasing power and in terms of competitiveness. And as Frédéric has said, that's where we strongly disagree, is that this crushes the difference in salaries. If you increase the minimum wage, then the risk is that the whole chain will move. And there you lead to an increase in payroll. One can understand you need to make an effort with the minimum wage, but if you readjust all the salaries, that will impact payroll, and it will include the highest salaries in the company. And this will have a huge impact on the company. So that you have to be careful about. Every time the government wants to legislate on the minimum wage, this can lead to major shifts. At the present time, companies, through negotiations, annual obligatory negotiations, can readjust things, perhaps not sufficiently, but in 2023, increases made it possible to offset inflation. Third risk, there's a risk of inflation. If you start to change salaries, you increase purchasing power, and this leads to a vicious circle, which is harmful for the economy. So there's a real risk that you crush wages, and there's a real risk of an inflationary spiral. I don't agree. because in fact the mobile wage scale no longer exists. In 82, this was provided for in a law. When the minimum wage increases, and there's certain companies that do this often, then the remainder of salary levels remains the same. And then on the last point, mentioned by Thibault, currently inflation linked to salaries. Well, people are trying to explain to us the problem for the last year. I looked at the latest studies and analyses, not by economists, but including by Jean-Hervé Lorenzi. It's these profits which feed inflation. So once again, you have to be reasonable. It's not increases in wages that increase prices and that create inflation. It's super profits and profits which generated inflation. I have a question linked to this loop. Some people have talked about prices and wages. Now, in a context of inflation, can one say that the real conflict today is not so much between enterprises and wage earners, it's between enterprises and wage earners and those who suffer from inflation? How can one ensure that the tools we currently have protect the losers and they are not overtaken by the winners? Well, the cost of raw materials has really exploded. Companies are finding it difficult to recruit. That raises the issue of productivity. So currently, we are in an inflationary trend owing to the excessive costs of raw materials. So that's a point that we have to note. Second point, value-sharing instruments. These are schemes which make it possible to correct the situation. You have a company which has high raw materials. This constrains its productivity, given difficulties encountered. Well, then these schemes make it possible to correct the situation. Now, I don't want to say mea culpa, but look at what happens in companies. Often, these schemes, when they're set up, they're not sufficiently well explained to show people the impact on purchasing power. We wouldn't have time to conduct a survey here, but ask a wage earner in July what the amount of his incentive or participation is. The person will probably not know exactly, and this is not sufficiently communicated in companies to show the impact on purchasing power. We're working on this in certain sectors. These instruments make it possible to correct the situation and create a better sharing of value, but not between sectors. For example, companies with big profits, would they share that? They'll share the super profits with wage earners, but they won't share with other companies, contrary to an upping of the minimum wage, which benefits everyone. The whole chain is impacted. But if the whole chain is impacted, the whole chain will suffer difficulties. A company leader knows about the constraints, and he can ensure that the schemes are intelligent ones. It's always difficult for a CEO to increase payroll because it becomes irrevocable. And that's a real issue for a CEO. I'm happy to recruit. I have a degree of flexibility, but when I increase my payroll through an increase in salaries, it's firm and definitive. So companies hesitate because the economic situation isn't very stable. So it's better to use these tools. Incentives need to be properly negotiated based on well-defined criteria. There must be some kind of workers' participation linked to the company results. This makes it possible to share better value if the value has been created. Yes and no. What works well in these agreements in terms of incentives and participation is when you give wage earners a lever that they can play around with a view to improving the incentive and participation system. Basically, and psychologically speaking, we raise our family with what we earn every month. Often, there isn't enough communication on participation and incentives, but these sums are often blocked for 5 years in savings plans and all sorts of other things. And it's like a savings plan if there is a problem for the wage earner. But the worker, what he looks at is the increase in his wages. So obviously, sometimes when we negotiate, we have annual obligatory negotiations on wages. This is obligatory, it's compulsory. It doesn't mean there may be an agreement in the end. And often trade unions are unable to understand if a company, for example, is not in a difficult situation on stormy seas, but its future is a bit unpredictable, then unions will not focus so much on salaries, but they'll try to see what other levers could be used. For example, bonuses or an increase in restaurant vouchers. There are all sorts of possibilities. There's not necessarily a conflict there. We have 4 minutes left, so I suggest we take 1 or 2 questions from the room. Other questions? Thank you for this outstanding debate. I have a question. There was a drop in productivity of 3% in France we saw recently, in 2022 in fact. So what will be the impact on the sharing of profits and this conflict between salaries and profits? Because if there's a drop in productivity, how can you increase wages? I'd be very cautious when talking about a drop in productivity. One of the first interpretations in a drop of productivity, in fact, is impacted by trainees in a company. You train people, make sure they're employable, and it's all these young people in the company which have an impact, and this may appear to be a drop in productivity. So if that's the case, it's actually desirable because it will provide for better employability in the future. Any other questions? Go ahead. I have a question on something you didn't touch on. It's linked to the title. What about wage earners who hold shares? In my company, all employees are shareholders. Well, in France, we have schemes on free shares and other issues. The idea is to help employees gain access to company capital. So I'd like to hear what you think about employee shareholding. Are you in favor, or does this bother you? I'll be clear. Wherever this exists, it works. So much the better. Now, for my union, that's not our main claim or demand. It's great when it works, but that's not what we really tend to highlight. We're not actually bothered by it, but I think we need to talk about this more, and perhaps in 4 or 5 years. I think these free shares and access to capital is a wonderful thing. You have lots of different kinds of companies. Some are big, some are small, some are medium. size. Big companies, there's no problem to set up this kind of scheme. But when you're the boss of a small or medium-sized company, opening up the capital, depending on your structure, it may not be easy to achieve. You can share value. That's an intermediate solution that enables companies that don't have an open capital to set up incentives based on an increase in the value of the company. We're going to test the system for 5 years. We'll see whether the practice makes it possible to improve the situation, and this will enable non-diluted companies to transmit perhaps a little bit of the company in a virtual manner. You have to look at the annual valuation of the company, the value in cash. If you're talking about a bakery or a very small company, it may be very complex to assess its value. So the idea is to share value, and this will be tested for the next 5 years. That brings us to the end of this session, and thank you for your participation. I hope it proved useful, and we wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Thank you.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this overheated tent in Aix-en-Provence. Obviously, we're all used to it. Everybody has their bottle of water or their fan to try and hold for the whole time of a conference, which should be very animated because we've covered topics like housing, mobility, and it is true that now lifelong training is very important. I wouldn't say to fight against unemployment because we have almost no unemployment apparently in France these days, but in order to restore value to the training of people throughout their life. Before I give the floor to Nathalie Chusseau, the economist, professor at the University of Lille, and she holds the chair of economic transition in the Institut Bachelier. We have with us Alain ROUMILHAC, president of Manpower France, Dominique RESTINO, who is president of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Paris and Ile-de-France, Florence, former minister of the army, and recently you were designated as a chairperson of the board of CNAM, which is the National Conservatory for Arts and for Arts et Métiers, and Cyril MALARGÉ, CEO of Sopra Steria, one of the European leaders in digital council, and Mrs. ZEGHAL, who is Director General of the campus of Paris Dauphine in Tunis. So, we have 55 minutes for discussion. Obviously, we'll try to keep some time for questions from the audience. I would like to thank all those who are here and those who are following throughout the world and via streaming. Without further ado, Nathalie Chusseau, a brief introduction of the topic, how can lifelong education be enhanced? And then you'll all have a few minutes. Thank you. By way of introduction, I would say that the job market in France is doing well. Unemployment rate around 7% and employment rate very high, one of the highest since the 70s. But all this is in a world of what I would call radical transformation. Digital revolution, AI are going to modify considerably the job structure. We feel that 39% of employees have a strong risk of seeing their job automated. And the recent study by Goldman Sachs are saying that AI might destroy 325 million jobs in the world, including a large part in Europe. Then there are the challenges of decarbonation by 2050 that might destroy jobs and create jobs. And then there's a demographic transition that is going to change the number of jobs in the care for dependent people and elderly people. So, jobs are going to be destroyed, others are going to be created, and we have to adapt to the skills because demand is constantly changing. Apart from that, apparently we have a scarcity of workers in some areas, All this in a context where 80,000 youngsters drop out of school every year. So it seems that lifelong training is absolutely necessary to protect against the obsolescence of qualification, to develop skills and to adapt constantly to the ever-changing labor market. So this is a tool that is absolutely necessary for employers and workers. But every year in France, only 32% of French workers take part in training that is related to work. This leads to an issue of funding of vocational training. The regions are taking a large part in that. And there's considerable change with apprenticeship, as now we have more or less 1 million apprentices, but companies have a large role to play as training has to take place at all ages in life to prepare for professional transitions and to anticipate for change of jobs or reconversion. So how can we move companies to invest more in the development of their workers' skills? Must we make lifelong training obligatory or compulsory for companies and workers? What can we do to continuously apply to an ever-changing market? What about the soft skills? And how can we adapt lifelong training to the job journey at all ages in life? So these are the questions. Well, a very nice presentation of the landscape. Well, manpower now. Alain, ROUMILHAC, as I was saying, manpower supports companies in their daily life for the changes in their work, and this requires a constant adaptation. Well, yes, this has led to a constant transformation. It forces us to anticipate, as you said. I believe that the transformations that we're facing mean that a number of companies are going to face a wall in terms of skills, so they are to think about qualifying their workers. What projects can I develop to make sure I have the right skills? How can I change the skills, and what are the means I'm putting into this? Sometimes, as I talk to corporate managers who are announcing huge investments, I'm very struck by the fact that when we ask them how much money they're going to devote to the training part, they are surprised. And when I say, well, do you think that if you invest $1 billion, 3%, let's say 30 million would be a good figure? Maybe the companies will have to fund more, and the state will have to better use its money on this topic. And the second aspect I would like to mention is the idea of reducing unemployment from 7 to 5%. At 7%, almost all employable people have a job. So we're going to have to train massively the people whom we want to insert. We have to be able to support them, to help them have an idea of what they're going to do, to help them train once they have defined a project. I believe that at present, all too often do we say to people, well, let's train you and you'll see what you want to do afterwards. So we have to do the reverse, and we'll see what the law contains. We'll see how they are able to support the job seekers and give them access to the training they need to correspond to the needs of companies. Thank you for being so concise. Let's all continue along those lines so that the audience has more time for questions. Dominique RESTINO, let me remind everyone that you're the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Paris and Ile-de-France. So you support companies in their daily life. Can you buy into this lifelong training? How is it possible? Well, hello, thank you for coming to listen to us because in view of the time and in view of the weather, it's very hot here. Every year we train 72,000 people in our Chamber of Commerce. I tend to say 42,000 for initial training, including 19,000 apprentices and 30,000 for vocational training. But what I'm saying now that the educational group of the Chamber of Commerce of Paris, Ile-de-France, are training 72,000 people in vocational training throughout life. What I mean is that lifelong training doesn't start when you're 45. It starts when you're small, when you're a child. And this is why this leads me to the question you're asking. How can we enhance the lifelong education? I don't want it to be enhanced. I want people to buy into it. I want it to be part of I want it to be accepted in society. Earlier on, in another room, we talked about what choice of society for tomorrow. We talked a lot about environmentalism and ecology, and I agree with that, but I believe that the main transformation of our society and societies will be lifelong education. And through this lifelong education, we have made a lot of effort. We have 14 schools. There's ESCP is a school of the Chamber of Commerce, ECP as well. Les Gobelins also, which is the best cinema school, or a school of French gastronomy. So the important thing is that for the past 2 centuries, the Chamber of Commerce of Paris, Ile-de-France is changing schools, creating programs, creating new curricula, and developing training, because we train the men and women that companies need. And I would say it's even more, because today, through training, we have trainings that do not lead, that are long and lead to a diploma, but we also have very short trainings. And we have some trainings that enable people who have less time to be able to learn and to learn throughout their life. Over the past few months, we've been talking a lot about preparation for retirement. We now say that from the age of 53, you're a senior. I've been a senior for a while, I know that, but maybe we should change that age, because after all, the idea of health is to live longer and better, and the key might be lifelong training. We were talking about cuisine, and you will tell us what you have in your drawers. Mrs. Florence Parley, you are the new chairperson of the chairperson of the board of CNAM. You just started in these functions, so you're just discovering what it's all about. But I guess you have an overall idea of the topic and a few specific ideas, if only about the fact that you work with companies through apprenticeships. You have to mobilize companies now. Yes, I would like to say that apart from being a chairperson of the board of this great establishment, which is totally unique, I was lucky enough to take part in 2 governments that defined VAE, which is and also a law on professional training that helped apprenticeship develop. So, as you said, learning is something that evolves. A great number of jobs are not filled in because we lack people with the right qualifications, and the job market evolves because we are in a situation where things are moving very fast. The situation is almost full employment, and the idea is to have an initial training that will correspond to the needs of companies and the needs of the economy. Talking about the people who do not have a job, it's important to be able to supply and to offer the right support to help them return to job or to employability. And I could tell you more about this because at the Ministry of the Armies, I had a great experience. And then the people who CNAM takes care of are also people who already have a job and need to evolve. First of all, because they wish to, and here you talk about the social ladder, because you need to have a will, but they're also corporate workers or companies that need their workers to adapt to the jobs of tomorrow. As you heard, there's a number of essential public policies that are being revived, the need to organize the environmental transition so that we have green industries that will enable us to create new industries, to decarbonate the existing ones. We need people in the health sector, in the energy sector. I would like to say that the nuclear sector is losing a whole generation with people retiring that represent a huge know-how. So we are giving a new impetus to this sector, and we'll have to recruit 100,000 new people in the nuclear sector to provide for the needs. So we already have quite a lot of bottlenecks, but we have to make sure that we supply the critical jobs that are necessary in the critical sectors. In the Rencontres Économiques d'Aix-en-Provence, there's a lot of companies present, and I would like to say that we, people who are in charge of creating trainings and curricula that correspond to the needs of companies, we need the companies, because who better than them could define the needs? This co-construct of training programs must first of all consider the topic, which are the skills that are necessary. Also, you must also cater for very short-term needs, not only engineers who are trained over a period of 6 years, but people who can be trained in a very short term. And now we have a lot of remote training, and a combination of all this will enable us to prepare for the future. I don't want to take more of your time, but this is the mission of CNAM and other organizations. But for that, if we want to remain pertinent, we must have a pertinent dialogue with companies. Well, we'll come back to that, Mrs. Parly. Cyril MALARGÉ, you're CEO of Sopra Steria. Today, as the various speakers have shown and told us, we're facing extreme changes, AI, energy transition. All this represents quite a lot of possibilities and challenges. Lifelong training, in your opinion, is it necessary to work in-house and train your own teams? This is an important point, I guess, of your management at Sopra Steria. Yes, first of all, hello everyone. Thank you for being here despite the heat. I would like to pick up what Florence said, because we are both very aware of what's at stake. Today, companies are facing huge challenges, that of transformation. I'm not going back to the environmental issues, the automation, competitiveness, global competitiveness, attractiveness, and this ability to get the loyalty and to retain the best talents. All this is linked to the skills, and this skill challenge is absolutely essential. You gave a number of elements, but I want to add to what you said, and 85% of jobs that will exist in 2030 do not exist just yet. 50% of hard skills have a life cycle of less than 5 years. And even more in my job, which is technology. So initial training gives you a starting base, but it's not enough for your career. And companies have to manage skills in a dynamic manner. Skills are a flow, something that flows, that changes, and there's also something that has to come from the workers, because getting trained also means making an effort on their part. I don't want to give people any lessons, and I will remain very humble, but I want to say that at Sopra Steria, we are 60,000 engineers and consultants. Every year we recruit 10,000 new people, and almost 8% of of the whole wage mass goes into training. So, soft skills, supporting efforts, trusting, and going from training to learning. When you talk about soft skills, what is it? Ability to synthesize, learning to learn, leadership, creativity. Let's talk about AI. The right use, the proper use of AI does not require any technological skills. You need to have a critical mind, the ability to ask the right questions, and the ability to reason critically as to the result given by the machine. You have to trust also. Trusting people is going further. I recommend giving free access to all staff to the list of training and the tools. But that's not enough. The role of a company is to encourage and give more importance to training. So we are still learning, but in June, for example, we decided that June would be the learning month. So every worker, all 60,000 of them, received some learning content in their mailbox in the form of articles, video clips, or whatever, to make them want to learn. And the last point is that it's not enough to train people. You have to apply what you've learned very quickly. Otherwise, the money is lost, the personal investment is lost, and the role of employers is to organize the staging and the development, and to end up, because we only have 4 minutes, well, you'll get more afterwards. But to me, the companies that succeed are the ones that understand that skills have to be at the very core of their strategy. Those who stake money on the skills of their staff and have a kind of compact with their staff will succeed. But in my opinion, it's all in the execution of things, in the implementation. Amina ZEGHAL, you're the Director General of the campus of Tunis of the University Paris Dauphine. Very soon we'll turn to the international world, but how do you see the relationship, the connection between university and companies? Well, I would like to start by a question. Would you ask your doctor to prescribe a drug that enables you to remain in good health throughout your life and to avoid stress? In the same way, you cannot ask for a university diploma to guarantee your job throughout your life. Everybody knows now that they have to train throughout their lives to remain competitive, agile, and competent. We all know that 25% of the jobs are going to change in the next 25 years, as you said earlier. Technical skills in the 70s used to last 40 years. Now they don't last more than 18 months. And companies are aware of that. And at the very core of their strategy, they have training and investment in training in the same way as they look at the automation of processes. They trust that they can train their staff, but what they're afraid of is the scarcity of skills, the volatility of workers, which is why you have to train better and more efficiently and more people. The Tunis campus is considered as an educational accelerator. We decided to go from the status of training or content provider to training accelerator. This is done by supporting companies, offering solutions to companies to help them retain their managers, to help them increase the skills or further the increase in skills of their managers. A few years ago, we didn't have a lifelong training department, and now it represents 30% of our revenue, and we want to develop it even more, thanks in particular to an investment into the techno training. For example, we have a program called U-Jobs, U as in university. The idea is to work hand in hand with companies to attract talent and to develop the employer's brand on the campus. For example, the companies will fund deserving students who haven't got the means to study. So this is to show that we consider it's absolutely essential to adapt very quickly and to develop some agility, to work together with companies, especially via lifelong training. In order to do that, we need to work in close cooperation with them. And we must also think about how we can develop things together and share the right vision. So this, in fact, satisfies some specific demands, probably, but you're also expecting specific solutions from university or companies. Alain ROUMILHAC, coming back to you. About the involvement of companies in practice, how can we convince companies to invest more in training, and with what means? Because we have the tools, they have a toolbox. What is your toolbox?
I think that enterprises have fully understood that it's very complicated to find the skills they need on the market. No doubt the market linked to the economic situation will be less tense at the end of the year and beginning of next year, but currently things are very complicated. So I think the companies have understood that in a large number of cases they have to anticipate. They need to hire people with potential and train them in order to have the people they need in order to succeed as a company, to succeed with production and to continue to grow. Companies have to accept that they won't overnight find the skills they need on the market. So that means you have to think forward, you have to anticipate. You bring people into the company and you have to accept that they will need training. It's something we've somewhat forgotten. And there's the second topic, as I mentioned in my introduction. We have to be able to look at the future. We have to look at the not 10 or 15 years ahead, because that's pretty unpredictable, but on the whole, each company over the next 2 or 5 years knows basically where it wants to head, because it has transformation projects. We talk about decarbonization. The investments required will span several years or maybe even a decade. So we know that within 3 years, we know which projects for decarbonation will be required, which digital projects will be set up. And we can understand the impact on skills, therefore, so we can therefore anticipate. Anticipation is particularly important because we're working with people, changing skills And changing behaviors takes time. We have to act at the level of each individual. We say to our customers that they need to have a macroeconomic approach. How are things going to evolve? And then each individual has to be able to look forward. What is the ability of the person to learn? And do they really want to learn? And that is what defines the kind of job that you can reposition these people in. Those who evolve a lot and are highly motivated can jump ahead. Those who progress less well will have to be positioned in jobs where they don't need so much more training. When we support companies in this area, a lot of people say, well, maybe my skills aren't needed in this company, maybe they're needed elsewhere. And in that case, you know what, rather than changing skills, I'd rather change company. So you have to adapt skills in companies. How can you do this in the company itself? There are structures which are encouraged by the law, the CFA, these training in the company. Is that worthwhile when it comes to working at each individual level? I'd like to put this question to Dominique. With the companies you work with in commerce and industry, well, it's quite something to manage a trainee. So we support companies in this area. I'd like to revert to one point. I've heard a lot of interesting things, but it's not just the companies that need to look forward. It's not just the employees who need to evolve. It's not just a problem of the unemployment agency. It's not just the problem of the unemployed. It's everyone's problem. Companies know full well that they have a problem. They have a problem because they need to recruit for tomorrow morning, for next month, or next year. And in fact, I'm sorry, I think that to answer the question, we need to look forward by 15, 20, 25 years. We need to have a clear vision. Why? 87% of companies have less than 20 employees. It's mainly the big companies that use the training schemes because they're well organized. And that's what is of fundamental importance. The bosses of very small companies, well, the chambers of commerce helps the tradesmen and small or medium-sized companies. They represent half of the ongoing training budget. And if it's not the whole of society and all the stakeholders who are concerned, we'll never be able to improve the situation and really make the most of ongoing learning and training. Regions, cities, the state. I say that for me, we have the environmental issue, global warming, as Florence was saying. We need to train people here, there, and elsewhere. All these sectors of activity need training throughout the year, and that's what's going to transform our society, I think. We have very pragmatic CEOs with us. People talk about economics not being within the realm of politics. We have to look forward a long way. We can start on a small scale and then ramp up. In the long-term vision, you need very short training courses, probably. How do you work on that? That's what was said earlier on. Look, in retraining, I see a lot of 30 years old who've done gone through wonderful schools, and they want to retrain to work in cooking, for example, because they are passionately interested in it. They're going to open up a restaurant or a whole restaurant chain. They are rethinking their job. This is a reconversion that can happen throughout one's life. Do you think that companies have truly understood what's at stake in terms of ongoing training, lifelong training? You're in contact with your partners all the time. What's your feeling? Are companies mainly aware of the need for lifelong learning? It's hard to make a general statement, as we have said. Big companies have understood the importance of this issue. And a lot of big companies didn't wait to create training structures in-house. They have in-company universities to continue to train employees throughout their professional career. The possibility of accessing ongoing training is perceived as attractive for young people who are joining a company, and also it's a way to boost loyalty amongst headcount. So yes, big companies, I think, have fully understood the issue. We have a very nice example in CNAM with collaboration with MBDA. This is a partnership which enables technicians to become engineers, high school leaving diploma +5 in a couple of years. Of course, this calls on a lot of willpower among the individuals concerned, but it also calls for a lot of support from the company. You have to give the employee time, encourage the employee, rather than making the person think that this is a waste of time. So it's a real investment. The issue is that for smaller companies, you have to get them to become aware of the importance of training. I'm talking about CNAM. That's what you're here for. CNAM is present in 230 places in France, and I think one of our assets, I hope my neighbor won't contradict me, is that local structures work very closely with the socio-economic world and the chambers of commerce. Why? It's the local socio-economic world that can best determine what the needs are at the level of an employment catchment area. So as I said, you have to tailor-make things. You have to go into the finer details in the various territories. And our 230 locations are in very medium-sized cities. And this rounds off government action. It's very important to be able to reach out to these young people and less young people. You don't just have online training, you can round this off with all sorts of contact. So I think the more tense the labor market, the less easy it is for employers to find skills, the more we have a window of opportunity, and we hope it will last for a long time. This may be a sign that full employment is present. We have a window to convince companies that there are interlocutors, not just CNAM, there are interlocutors who are here to meet their needs, providing there is a real dialogue and that we can exchange on all these topics. We have this direct relationship between the university and companies as well. Same issue. Yes, indeed. Companies can anticipate their future needs for skills. They can reflect on their strategy, put this at the core of their strategy for the next 5 years. In fact, when they come to see educational professionals, they want something immediate. They want almost immediate skills. They're very careful about the return on investment when buying training. So how should one react to all this? Obviously, today we talk increasingly about nimbleness. We talk about internationalization as well. I'd like to talk about Dauphine. In my case, Dauphine decided to set up its first international campus in Tunis to be close to international companies based in Africa. The goal of the model is to train to benefit from all the Paris-based skills and adapt this to the region while adding a local layer. Cyril, in terms of training, how can you recruit the right colleagues, the right employees? Do you have an in-house strategy? Do you work directly with universities, for example? That indeed is essential for the company. You have to put up the requisite means. Training entails a lot of investment, and you have to believe in training in the long term. It's not enough just to provide one course. Situations are very diverse, very varied. I know this is true on our campus. You need to have long-lasting relationships with schools and universities. Every year we have over 500 activities carried out in schools and universities. We also hire a lot of trainees and train them. So yes, indeed, we need young people who want training. We're not saying that they all have to be ready to be employed. We want people to have a well-rounded education. What works at one point may be outdated 2 years later. So we need to have trained people who can evolve and who can learn in the future a new technology, a new job, and so on. Before I give the floor to the room and draw some conclusions, we have Dominique who's here. But Madame Paris, I'd like you to backtrack a bit as the Minister of the Army. The Army is very specific. I think that you train 26,000 young people. You recruited 26,000 young people who have no school-leaving diplomas. Others are highly qualified. You train them, and when they leave the Army, they're fully trained. Can that be exported to the private sector? We have to be very quick. Well, in a nutshell, why do we do this? We recruit 26,000 young people every year. That's a huge number who have all sorts of different skills. The reason is that the French Army provides employment as a sort of a flow. Every year, an equivalent number of soldiers leave the Army. So that means that we have to be able constantly to attract young people. One of the reasons why you can attract young people is this commitment to provide training. Some people dream of becoming a soldier when they're very young, but others have no initial qualifications. They say to themselves, well, I'll learn something if I join the Army, which will serve me later on. And it's true that the Army invests hugely in training young people. That's why we have contracts with these young people. We have a 5-day, sign a 5-year contract to invest for 5 years and then to have to start all over again. And because they leave to join competition, well, we try to boost loyalty a little bit, but not too much, because they have to remain young, alert, and fit to be in the Army. And also, our promise must be kept. That is, military staff who return to civilian life have to have the right skills. So while they're in the Army, we need to give them recognized skills. And that calls for two things. First of all, we train these young people while they're at the Army, and we also, when they leave the Army, try to find them jobs. So it's like an employment agency. We reclassify every year about 13,000 people, because not everyone needs this institution to find a job. And also, I'd like to stress that we help military who leave the Army and also their spouses. So thank you to the French Army. I'd like to pay tribute to the Army. It is indeed a fantastic way to provide training. People learn a job. People learn all sorts of things in the Army. But quite frankly, there is a process here that can indeed provide ideas when it comes to reconversion. In the Chambers of Commerce, in our partnership with the Army, we also learn a great deal. We train employees, and we can help companies. With the Chamber of Commerce in this area, we give training also to CEOs. Please be very quick. I'll be very quick. I just wanted to go back to what was said. Soft skills. When I recruit someone who's spent time with the Army, I have a guarantee of value, which I can firmly believe in. That's a fundamental guarantee. Companies can learn a great deal from this. This kind of teaching should be exported to the private sector. If we continue to have full employment, then we will need to succeed with the employability of those who are the least employable. There are some in the army. I would like to invite everyone to visit the Fontenelle-le-Comte Regiment. We have adapted to the military professional training system. It's the AFA who comes to the regiment, and furthermore, look what the military service overseas does. 88% of these young people who quit school can find jobs when they finish with the army. So it's a question of supervision in the long term and supervision in terms of the number of adults who work with these young people. It's a wonderful commitment. How do you currently train young people in new technologies? How do you react to this? Is it positive? This way of, does it help to get people onto the job market? Indeed, we try to reinsert a number of people in the job market. We share this vision. Indeed, we have to provide more support to people who are a long way from the job market. In our country, we give benefits, unemployment benefits, rather than support. We need to support people. There are a lot of people who have the will, they don't know how to go about it. And we have to help them to choose a job and then to go for training, learn certain basic skills. And if we do that kind of thing, I think we'll be able to get a lot of people far from the job market back into a job. A quick conclusion, and then we'll give the floor to the room. We'll thus be able to go deeper into certain matters. Well, just a few points. We have to work in employment catchment areas, the territory and companies in the territory, chambers of commerce, support in small and medium-sized companies. That's a key issue. Support for employees. The motivation of employees is, of course, very important. We need to propose short training courses to meet immediate needs and make people rapidly operational. Support companies to show them how important training is. It's not just a cost, it's actually an investment. Establish long-lasting relationships with schools and universities. The importance of soft skills. We don't need colleagues right away. Train people in young companies, draw inspiration from the army, and at a time of full employment, we need to ensure that the people the furthest removed from the job market get jobs. Well, you deserve a round of applause, but things aren't over yet. Just raise your hand and then you'll get a microphone. I'm not saying I can give everyone the floor. Who wants to speak? Please introduce yourself very quickly and ask a very short question so that we can take lots of questions and answers. Gilles Berfond. I used to work in the aeronautical industry. Excellent work is done by CNAM and the Chambers of Commerce, but there's someone who's absent, namely national education. The national education system bears huge responsibility when it comes to adapting skills. It would be interesting to see what you think about the national education system. The issue is that we know that people who leave the French educational system are not necessarily very adaptable. The skills aren't very suitable in terms of what companies need. The basic raw material, if I may say, is not at the right standard. One or two issues here. First of all, apprenticeship is hugely successful, but apprenticeship is mainly for those with a school-leaving diploma. The national education must force itself, together with companies, to train young people before the school-leaving diploma, teach them technical jobs, industrial jobs, teach them about restaurants and other things like that. In terms of reindustrialization and ecological transition and digital transition, we won't succeed in this area if we don't have more people who take up the sciences. We have to massively increase the number of engineers we train. These are 2 points And if we do this in the short term, then we'll be able better to respond to companies' needs. We have a school, the CIT, dedicated to cybersecurity and digital areas. Yes, indeed, we train 19,000 young people at the Chamber of Commerce in these areas every year. Do you know how many apprenticeship contracts are broken? It's 28 to 30%. In other words, you try to put a young person in contact with a company, and by month 2 or 3, the person says he wants to quit, and that's quite disastrous, both for young people and for the company, but for young people above all. So this represents a huge cost. We try to include 91% of young people after 11 months really join the company. And it's only 5 to 7% of young people who quit. We put up a lot of means to ensure that we give support both to companies and these young people. We'll come and see you. Quality is what enables us to really provide skills to these young people. We need to work with the national education system, but I don't think we should judge it. Would you like to say a few quick words? And in fact, in terms of the national education system, it's important to consider the digital transformation, which should also be part and parcel of the overall strategy. I assist people at home. I have 4 diplomas and a school-leaving diploma. You talked a lot about companies, but now with digital technologies, we need to talk about services too. I work with the CESU system. Sometimes we don't need to have a company. We just need the administration to stop thinking that it must direct everything. It has to put its trust in us. I wanted to raise this point because we need all these people, including self-employed. A lot can be done in terms of household help and using the CESU scheme. We'll stop there, the gentleman behind, and then we'll have one last question. I have a very quick question. We talked a lot about certain matters, but how can ongoing learning help to retain talent already in a company? This is a topic that's at the heart of company concern. These companies invest in training their headcount, and they don't want people to leave the company, obviously. Often what we observe is that people are sent for training, and then people, as of the next day, can't apply immediately what they've learned. This may last for a week, 1 week, or 3 weeks, and then people feel that they may want to leave. So if you want to retain young people, of course it's difficult to set up, but you need to be able to train people and then organize things in such a way that people can apply their skills in the company. That's of fundamental importance. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we can't take the last question, but you'll be able to discuss matters together. We now have to close the session because there are other sessions which will now take place. Thank you very much for your participation. I thank our speakers and thank the audience.
Bonjour, bonjour à tous, bienvenue, installez-vous.
Hello, welcome. Take your seats for this controversy on a burning topic to increase the temperature. Grandpa boomers, a burden on economies. I'm Pierre Boyer. I'm a teacher in economics in the Polytechnic School. And I'm a researcher also in CPR. And we have two speakers, high quality speakers, who will tell us about what they feel in view of their experience. Magda Tomasini is at the head of the National Institute for Demographic Studies, which is an observatory coordinating research on demography in France, and Bruno Angle, who is the CEO of AG2R La Mondiale, a company that supports and insures individuals, and which is also the French leader of insurance companies, at least in 2022. Let's start with Magda. Well, thank you. Yes, the population is aging. In 2050, 1 out of 6 on this planet will be over 65. For Europe and France and the US, it will be 1 out of 4. Since 2018, the over 65 are now in greater number than the under 65. France cannot escape this movement. We have 1 person out of 4 in France that is over 60. If you compare to the rest of Europe, France is rather not in a bad situation. France is rather younger than Italy, with a fecundity rate of 1:2. But let's not forget that in France, the regions are not uniformly distributed. In some areas, apart from aging faster than the rest of the country, the equipment for elderly people is not as dense, with less carers and less health agents, like in the Virgin Islands, in the Martinique and Guadeloupe, for example. In terms of economics, the economic level of the over 60 is close to that of people working. They consume a lot of goods and services. They have some economic power, possibilities of investing, and they also have a potential, which is more difficult to measure, in terms of supporting youngsters and supporting the younger generations and committing into associations. Thank you very much. Bruno, let's all realize that we are on the eve of a major demographic shock. Why? Well, I'm not a demographer, but it's easy to understand. 75 years ago, we had what was called the baby boom. And this wave has been propagating over the past 75 years. It was predictable, but it was not properly anticipated. And it means that 75 years later, the baby boomers have become grandpa boomers. And this is due to the baby boom and the lengthening of life. Thanks to these two elements, we end up in a situation where overall, if you compare to a few years ago, the number of people in France who age beyond 75 is being multiplied by a factor of 4 or 5. By 2026, we'll have over 1 million people who will be over 75. So this represents a major challenge for us, which is probably one of the most important challenges with that of climate for the younger generations. It's not necessarily bad news, because if you live longer, obviously it has its good sides. We live longer in a society that will have 4 generations living together. So we'll have 4 generations coexisting. So it's good news in a way, because it means that more and more great-grandparents will be lucky to know their great-grandchildren, and great-grandchildren will be lucky enough to know their great-grandparents. So that's good news, but these good news come together with a number of challenges in terms of offer of services, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of funding. Thank you for these elements. Before I take the questions from the audience, I would like Magda to tell us about the financial challenges of those issues. DRES considers that we would have to be able to host an additional 100,000 elderly people more in the establishments, specialized establishments. Well, when we talk about aging, we talk a lot about pensions, but there's also the policy for support. According to the research on dependence prepared by DRES, in 2014, dependence represented more or less 1% of the GDP. By 2060, this figure will represent over 2% of the GDP. And so these are huge financial amounts. And it seems that according to the projections and the macroeconomic hypotheses are not helping much. We know we have Jean-Michel Charpak in this room, and I know that the funding of dependence is an old topic. He used to take care of the reflection group in 2010 on the first laws on this topic when Roselyne Bachelot was minister. So it involves a number of sectors, health, concerning the pathologies, families, housing, and some invisible costs, for example, like a tax support, which is rather important. So these various instruments of public policy are being solicited, and we have to work on them. Well, very well. Thank you very much for these elements. The amounts are huge. One reaction. Bruno, you said that this challenge of aging was predictable but hadn't been anticipated. The grandpa boomer generation, which held great responsibilities in the private and public sector, is now managing its assets. Could you say that they are a generation of people who were irresponsible? No, that's not what I would say. The idea is not to have a burden weighing on this generation, which, if you look at the progresses accomplished in the past 75 years, these people have been helping society and the country to develop. But without criticizing, we can't absolve them totally, because there was a part that could be anticipated in all that. And the time we now have to give answers to this wave, demographic wave, is being reduced. And I believe there was a lack of anticipation. Why did I say that this is the most important challenge with that of climate? Well, I believe that the good news is that you can correct the issue of aging well faster than the issue of climate. Because for climate, the non-decision making process or the wrong decisions of the past make it very difficult to correct things. But for aging well, we can consider that we still have a possibility to act, which is the reason why, as the general manager of AG2R La Mondiale, I rang a warning bell a few months ago, in a constructive manner, saying that we had to all work together, because when you're faced with such a challenge, there's no magic solution, no panacea to solve everything. I believe the answers should come from a panel of stakeholders, including the state, territorial communities, private companies, and citizens. everybody must be mobilized. You have to have a notion of general mobilization if you look at this issue of aging well. And we need a range, a number of tools in order to show more regard and more value for carers, whether you talk about professional ones or family ones. I was faced with that situation, and my father was in such a situation 2 years ago, and I could see how my mother, as a family helper, was faced with so much problem. And Mrs. Bourguignon, when she talked about 350,000 people, mentioned that. What did we do to face this challenge? Not sufficiently. Not sufficient. Not enough, sorry. So amongst our citizens, some people want collective solutions and others prefer to stay at home. But as a society, we must be able to give an answer in both cases. For people who are looking for collective solution, you have the senior service residents, which are far away from the EHPADs. These residences are for people who are valid and who are looking for a secure environment with a number of services. The EHPADs are for people who are no longer autonomous and who need care. AG2R became top shareholder of Domitis, which is the main senior service residence actor in France. But AG2R and Agir Carco are offering diagnosis, for example, which for 15 years enable you to assess the adaptation if you want to stay at home. So 15 euros is something that everybody can pay. And when you talk about the work, the order of magnitude is about 10,000 euros. It can be very little for some, very much for others, which leads me to the last part of the solutions, which is the financial part. Something was set up with the PAC law, which is the retirement savings plan for youngsters who want to take care sufficiently early of this. If at the age of 30 you start putting 100 euros a month, you'll have 75,000 euros when you retire. But as a PACT is a recent law, it's not true. But you can think of solutions like the partial monetization of the real estate of seniors citizens, which is a form of solution which is more sophisticated in terms of the options, and which is more ethical than what we call viager, which is selling a form of selling until the person dies. So one last question from me for both of you. We talked about demography, about finance, but obviously you have the issue of justice when you think about the generation of baby boomers. We know you said that 4 generations would have to coexist, including 2 generations that are retired. And Magda, you said there was a difference between the metropolis and the other areas. Can you tell us what we can do to avoid conflict? Magda, let me get back to the West Indies example, because accelerated aging is something that can be an indicator of what's going to happen in mainland France. This is the result of research called Immigration, Family and Aging, which we carried out. And this phenomenon of accelerated migration, which we note in the West Indies, is due to a drop in fecundity of women, 2 children per woman, still higher than in the metropolis. And it's also due to the loss of active populations because of youngsters leaving for mainland France. So you lose some active population, and those who stay are those with little diploma. And 60% of the children under the age of 10 have had an episode of single parenthood, and half of them have only known a single parent. So if you look at the destiny of women in Guadeloupe and Martinique, they have to raise their children on their own and take care of their parents, all that in context of economic scarcity. So we have to think of policies in terms of so the social policy must be a global policy and not only targeting the elders. Well, I would look at the issue of justice under the generation aspect. I personally think, and I probably at the end of the baby boom, I was born in '64, so I'm at the end of this comet of the baby boom, of the baby boomers. But I believe we have de facto given 2 debts to the youngsters, 3,000 billions for France, plus an environmental debt. And if there was a way to funding properly the good, proper aging and dependency, it would be fair, probably. Well, we have 8 minutes left and 17 seconds for questions from the audience. Please introduce yourselves and ask short questions. The speakers have promised they would give short answers. Sir. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Where's the microphone, please? Obviously, I'm a grandpa boomer. One question, madam. Please reassure me, is our life expectancy still stabilized at 86 or 87, despite the number of people who are over 100 years? And, sir, I'm not so sure that the cohabitation of 4 generations is such a good thing. Well, for the life expectancy question, you will probably remember that we had a pandemic. So there was a movement of increase in life expectancy, but this has stopped. So we will need more time to check whether the impact, or let's say the step that we've reached in terms of life expectancy is linked to the COVID pandemic or not. We know 4 generations together. Well, the title of the new format is Controversies, so it's very good that we should not agree. I think that living longer is something that is a chance. So, in what state? Up till now, there's been, I'm not a doctor, but reasonably, we tend to say that the last 2 years are the more difficult ones. So if we have more life expectancy, we tend to live longer in good health. In my opinion, it's a chance, but it sends us back to a number of challenges that we have to solve together. Sir, let me be a bit provocative. We are talking about an ultra-liberal economy here. Elderly people are costly. What do you think of creating concentration camps and canceling or getting rid of all these people who are not bringing in any money? So obviously I'm being provocative, but sometimes this is what's happening. Now, listening to you and thinking back of what I've gone through in my life, it's not that funny, because in practice it's not what you're saying. the elderly people are being ill-treated nowadays, and this is serious. The investigations on EHPADs, you can read the research and the report, they are a disaster. They're being ill-treated. So it's all very well. We've lived 45, 50 years in the active population. Now we're good to be set aside, and I believe we should review the way in which we look at the topic. Elderly people can bring a lot, if only through their experience via in the companies, in administrations. They shouldn't be thrown away. They have a value, and I would like you to take this value into account. Thank you. We did say how lucky it was to have the coexistence of several generations. I don't think that's what we said. I did remind you that there was this economic weight of the senior citizens, but also the economic driver, because they can invest, and also because when you get to the end of your life cycle, you usually have some assets and you have invested in economics. I have reminded people about the role of the support of other generations and of the commitment to associations. I don't think we have a negative vision of aging. Bruno. Well, there would be a lot of answers to give you. Personally, I can commit the Groupe AG2R La Mondiale without consulting my board. I'm against concentration camps. But second point, very sincerely, in a country with 57% compulsory payments for social payments, I don't think this is ultra-liberal. Now, talking about the problems in the EHPADs, I don't have any EHPADs in my group. In the resident service senior, the rate of satisfaction of the residents is around 97%. So everybody has to take their responsibility in their sector, but I don't think you should generalize. The surveys that were published a year ago concerning some EHPADs, and in particular one group of EHPADs, and I believe this would be unfair. Thank you for this answer, madam. Yes, Catherine Marchetti-Safich. I'm an advisor in CSR strategy. Thank you for your interventions. I wanted to ask, don't you think there is a risk of opposing the various ongoing transitions, digital, demographic, and ecological, because they all require quite a lot of investments, and it might be interesting also, and I'm giving you my opinion there, it might be interesting to include in this transition the major social element. Bruno, well, excellent question, I must say. For me, it's quite simple. They shouldn't be opposed. We have two challenges ahead of us, that of climate as that of aging in good conditions. And to say things as people tend to say, we want both cheese and dessert, and to say it as our political authorities tend to say, it has to take place. Both things have to be done simultaneously, en même temps, as Mr. Macron said. So, Magda. Well, first of all, the young generation shouldn't think that by having no children, they're going to solve the climatic issues, because that's going to increase the demographic challenges. Hello, I'm Mr. Garcia. I have a question. A grandpa boomer has an economic weight. I would like to have some figures as to the support that they represent, because they're a major factor of consumption. It's true that they can be costly. Maybe you could give us a few figures. Well, Bruno, Magda, well, I haven't got the figures, I must say, but if you look at the accounts per category of household, but once again, as I said, The title of the controversy was provocative. We knew that history was not going along those lines. The title of this controversy is that of the Cercle des économistes, but I don't think that any of the people who spoke here on stage talked about the weight of this generation. Thank you, Bruno Wang, the General Manager of AG2R La Mondiale, and Magda Tomasini, Director General of INED.
Bonjour à tous.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're not too hot. We have 55 minutes to talk about a subject which I hope you'll find very interesting. Must one sanctuarize research? And I'd like to introduce the members of our panel. First of all, the Minister of Research and Higher Education. Thank you for being with us. Hello, thank you. Next to you, your counterpart from Djibouti, the Minister of Higher Education and Research from Djibouti, Mr. Nabil. Thank you for being here. Nicolas Dubourg, President of ISAT, an investment company. Thank you for your being here this evening. Béatrice Weber Timoro, thank you. She will be speaking English, so take headsets if you need them to listen to the simultaneous translation. She is president of CEPR, an economist, and Laurent Saint-Martin, CEO of Business France. It's the professor of economy, president of Paris Dauphine, who's going to set a framework for this debate. Should we sanctuarize research? Over to you. Thank you very much. Ministers, dear speakers, dear colleagues, I'm very pleased indeed to be here to set the framework for this debate, because of course I can't cover all the issues. It's a very vast debate. I didn't choose the title, Should We Sanctuarize Research Work? I'm saying this right away because given my position as president of a university, I could be accused of having disclosures to make. Should one sanctuarize research work? What does that mean? Sanctuarizing means giving something a sacred character, making it untouchable, or in more prosaic terms, providing public or private resources to make research perennial, be it research that is fundamental or otherwise. For a long time, people have been saying, well, why sanctuarize things? When you sanctuarize military spending, it's usually because there are opportunities or threats. And if people try to sanctuarize research, this is an investment. It means you have challenges. What are the challenges? What's at stake? I'll mention just one. In 2050, we'll be 10 billion inhabitants. There'll be a growth in the population, which will raise huge challenges in terms of climate, economy, society, health. We have problems of risks, sovereignty. And why research? Why respond by talking about research? Because usually it helps you to find the solutions so that our lifestyle can adapt and change in order to foster better ways of meeting the challenges. So one might say, okay, but why research? Well, the big technological innovations, disruptive innovations, are always born of fundamental research. I say fundamental research on purpose. For example, modern computers were born of the invention of a transistor, which wouldn't have been possible without quantum physics. Of course, we have a physicist here, and I hope I haven't made a mistake in what I say. If you look at artificial intelligence, well, fundamental research delivered the key elements so that it could be used by GAFA. So, research is fundamental in all these areas. research, okay, fundamental or applied research, but why the state? Is it only the state that is called upon to play a part? Yes, the answer is yes, but not only the state. Why? Because the state plays a key part in innovation. It's in the best position to support fundamental research in a disinterested way in the long term, hence this idea of sanctuarization, and it can make massive investment in the long term. Let us not forget that GAFAM themselves are born of the use of technologies which were financed by the state. ARPANET, the ancestor of Internet, was financed by the American public agencies. So there isn't just one way of taking up these challenges through research, but research financed by the state is of fundamental importance. You're all familiar with Wagner, a German economist. He explained that, he said, why should there be inexorable growth in spending in certain areas? Health, private investment is difficult to rope in because they need profitability. So the state has a fundamental part to play. And for example, Fred Thurman, professor of electronics at the University of Stanford, understood this. In America, traumatized by the 1929 crisis, he tried to put together the first entrepreneurial ecosystem combining companies and universities. My position is that the state is the backbone of the sanctuarization of research work. That's a good thing because the state can invest in research in a very profitable manner. My colleagues, Gagnery Lafayette, published a report which showed what I'm saying. A lot has been written about investment, public investment. Public investment in research is probably the most profitable form of investment. So we need state investment, and I'd like to wind up by referring to two further points. We can sanctuarize research work, and if the state has to do this, how should it go about it? Should it, since the Alain, huge efforts have been made to enable fundamental researchers to become entrepreneurs. It's quite outstanding, the progress that's been made. So if we want to recreate hope, we have to see what progress we've already made and not just view the problems. There are perhaps 3 or 4 issues that are really important. Fortunately, we don't just have the state present here. You have private players, analysts. One can wonder whether the massive investment, which has grown over the past few years in terms of projects, is that sufficient to sanctuarize research? We need to sanctuarize by investing in the core of the reactor. In France, we may underinvest in fundamental research. This is borne out in the figures. But this underinvestment in fundamental research is due to a lack of private investment. The private sector doesn't have the courage to come and invest. And then one last point. Does one invest in calls for projects? Military spending has been sanctuarized, for example, in an exemplary way. But what about the future? If we don't touch the core of the reactor, that is the wages of researchers, the brain drain. So we're really at a crossroads. Huge efforts have been made, but I think it's high time to move further. Fundamental research can answer the problem because we shouldn't focus only on applied research. Pasteur said that there was no difference between fundamental and applied research, so we need to focus on fundamental research in order to meet the needs of society in the future. Thank you for enabling me to sketch out the framework of the debate. Madam Minister, you heard what was just said by the president of Paris Dauphine University. You voted on a law which has increased the research budget by 30%, or will by 2030. Do you think that is sufficient? Do you think that the money is properly earmarked to avoid the brain drain? and a lot of people are attracted to go and work for the GAFAM. Thank you. We talked about this new law. We have a law on research work. 25 billion is going to be invested over 10 years. That's an increase of 5 billion net in the budget. But the basic budget, I'd like to give you a few figures. As you know, you're never small or big. You're always small or big faced with someone. So I want to talk about the international scene in Europe. In terms of France, people talk about the objective defined of 3% in Europe, but 3% of expenditure in research. Yes, expenditure in research should be 3%. The idea is to have 1% of state spending and 2% of private spending on research. We currently stand at 0.8 in terms of state spending and 2.1 or 2.2 or 3 compared with 3%. That's about 1.5% brought by the private sector. That's expenditure. So we're within the European average, which stands at about 2.2. We lag behind certain countries, but we're on par with the European average. We need to attain this goal, of course, which will be ever more difficult to attain with inflation, because these 2.2%, to move them up to 3% of GDP, that's impacted by inflation. Now I'd like to talk about investment. Here I've been talking about expenditure, but you have to look at state investment. State investment in France amounts to about 1% of GDP. And here, well, in expenditure, we rank 4th in G7. When it comes to state investment, we rank 1st, compared with Germany, the US, and so on. In other words, we are investing in research. This investment is thanks to this law. It's the initial budget of the ministries, MIRES, that's all the ministries which invest in research work. And we also have France 2030. With France 2030, the idea is to have 54 billion, 13 billion under this plan is earmarked for research and higher education. I'd like to talk about 2 more points. We have this idea of making the long-term investments perennial. You referred to the fact that if you look at the National Research Agency, the law has increased the success rate of this national agency. We'd fallen to 10 or 12%, which was a disaster. Now we stand at 24%. And the LPR, this programming law, aims at a 30% success rate, with 1 additional billion in this call for projects from the national agency. This national agency issues calls for projects which span 4 years, but France 2030 refers to 10-year projects, between 8 and 10 years. And one of the answers is to give people pluriannual funding so they have visibility in the long run. You are economists in 2030. We talk about a pluriannual plan over 10 years or a contract which spans 5 years. I know what that means. And that's what we're trying to do with our various establishments. We don't have 5-year contracts. We have contracts based on performance so that there's some pluriannual visibility. France 2030, these are projects with industry over 8 to 10 years. Fundamental or applied, there will be no innovation or applied research if we don't maintain high-level fundamental research. Who's in charge of fundamental research? Of course, the state entities or org entities or universities. And if you look at state spending, it stands at 51% for fundamental research. If you look at Tier 2, that is spending by companies, it's 7%, which goes to fundamental research. So it's true that we need to maintain this budget for fundamental research. Indeed, we need directly to be able to give to laboratories and entities I'd like to wind up by saying that what, in my view, is even more important than financing to maintain a high standard in research, in fundamental research, applied research, we have to have a close link with companies, and we need to give researchers time. We need to give research time. And the lever for me is administrative simplification. It's a problem of organization and mission more than a problem of financing. In this LPR, most of the money is designed to make research attractive. It's wages, it's compensation to boost the salaries of our researchers, because talent goes hand in hand with proper wages. Thank you very much. Mr. Nabil, Minister of Research and Higher Education in Djibouti. Do you agree with what you have just heard? That is, state investment in research is important, it's fundamental. We don't have the same problems, no doubt, in terms of volume. We don't have the same problems that you do. I believe that the minister and I wear two hats. There are a lot of frustrated researchers who didn't get money for their research work. Should we talk like that, or should we talk about ministers who need to hunt out financing? It's a huge dilemma. It goes without saying that today in Africa, just speaking in general terms, we talked about structuring research work. There are universities and research centers, so things are improving. The problem is that there is a risk of losing brains, and we need, therefore, to be able to retain researchers in Djibouti so that they can innovate and contribute to development. We've talked about financing, we've talked about wages, salaries. I think we share the same concerns, in other words. But there is a difference. When you're a small country like Djibouti, you are fortunate because there's a lot of globalization. Sanctuarization, well, I think the president of Dauphine University explained what was meant by sanctuarization. Financing research in a country like mine is fundamental. We cannot talk about development. We cannot talk about settling conflicts. We can't talk about resolving the issue of climate change if we don't have projects to offer. That's why Djibouti, through its National Lab for Climate Change, is creating the requisite structures so all researchers in the region can come to work in Djibouti, and so that we can retain our researchers who are trained in the best universities in order to meet the climate challenge, the problem of water, food security, health, energy, a certain number of issues, therefore, which affect the entire world. I said earlier on France 24 that the Americans and the Chinese will probably reach an agreement to work together in terms of climate change. I said to the minister, well, get people to work together on research so that we can optimize our means. Everyone can optimize the means used. So state budgets are not sufficient. We need to find additional budgets. We have the World Bank and other entities which might be interested, the French Agency for Development. And these funds can enable other researchers to do their work. There's a second point I want to mention over and above the common problems we share. I want to talk about partnership. Partnership is very important. We have a very good partnership with the IRD. The president of IRD is here. The Institute, Research Institute for Development. We talk about food security, biodiversity, and so on and so forth. This also makes it possible to resolve these problems of financing. One can find research topics and use platforms in Djibouti or the IRD which enable researchers to innovate and to do their work. Then there's the second point. I'd like to talk about two more points, the state budget. How can one find money to finance research? Currently, technologies are available for everyone. Africa, I would like to say, has reached a threshold in terms of the number of researchers who have exceeded our hopes. Should we keep them in Africa or should they be allowed to leave? We need to give them really good projects and decent wages if they're to stay in Africa. Nobody believed in this possibility. Nobody thought that students and our engineers would be able to produce satellites one day. So we're now launching 2 satellites. And this project attracted foreign investors who want to finance the launching of satellites. Our obligations are as follows. On these launch pads, engineers, researchers have to participate in all the phases of development of the technologies concerned. We need to look for other budgets. We need to think about international partnerships. It's really a question of globalization. Thank you. Nicolas Dubourg, you represent the private sector on this panel. You've heard all these repeated appeals and calls. There needs to be more private investment in research and in particular in fundamental research. What is preventing this? I'd like to describe what we do first of all, and you'll see why research is a great interest to us. We invest French funds in French company capital. The idea is to do this on the long term. We're deeply rooted in the real economy, and currently we focus greatly on industry and technology, and the two together. We've built up a portfolio with stakes in a number of wonderful companies, and currently we have developed a new angle. We work with younger companies. Most of them are industrial companies in the field of energy and in more conventional areas, together with technology. The idea is to create a new industry in France and to help companies to build their plants in France and in our various regions. What interests us in this venture is that we can create value, we can achieve growth. There can be no growth without innovation and without investment. So this harks back to what the minister has said. Investment is indeed very important. The good news is that these companies today, and we're aware of this, these companies are becoming fully equipped. If you look at companies, big companies like Arkema, Tech, Valeo, these are companies which invest in research and development. Here I'm talking about R&D. They invest a significant amount of their turnover, up to 20 or 25%, in order to make state-of-the-art semiconductors. They're 5 or 6 years ahead of the Chinese, and we have to maintain our research capacity in this area, together with the CEA in Grenoble. This is financed by the state, where there's a strong link between fundamental research and applied research in companies. We have companies that are investing heavily in these fields of the future. This is important for the energy transition. There are all sorts of applications for these new technologies. We are also keenly interested in SMEs. Working in the area of transition, we've identified about 150 such SMEs, and basically more than 80% do research. Why? Because they have hired researchers, or because they were created by researchers, or they have a strong link with people in research, and they therefore have patents, and they start their activity on that basis. And it's exactly what you were saying early on. These companies are partly financed by the 2030 France project, the idea being to focus on transition. I'll go quite fast as the speaker. I'm very optimistic in terms of researchers in companies. a little while ago, I started to work about 30 years ago. People said, hire a researcher at a company. Well, what is he going to do? Now, things have changed. Researchers are in hot demand in terms of artificial intelligence, for example. They find a job in an instant. Likewise, in energy, semiconductors. It's a golden age for research in companies. The problems are so very complicated that I have no concerns at all as to their ability to find a job. And to finish, I talked about the ability to invest. There should be significant funds available for investment. It's a question of sovereignty. So we have to really rush into this area. The research world and the finance world have to talk to each other. Research issues are very complicated and very intricate. They're very difficult to find your way around. And if we don't manage to talk to each other, it will be very difficult to help these projects to come to fruition. Thank you very much. Well, to attract brains and keep them, you need to have the right ecosystem. You need stimulation, collective stimulation. That is what you provide through the COPR, the Center for Economic Policy Research. Therefore, you are the president of this company, Beatrice. Do you think that it's good to invest in research? We've been talking about state and private investment, but you need to have a whole ecosystem as well, which is favorable in order to retain researchers in France and elsewhere in Europe. Yes, absolutely. I'd like to start by saying that I'm very pleased indeed to be here in Aix, and I wish to thank Rencontres Économiques for having invited the CPR. We're currently moving our headquarters from London to Paris. We want to benefit from the French ecosystem and be part of it. Despite that, I really don't dare to continue in French, and I apologize for moving to English.
I wanted to make 3 points. So the first one is, it is actually very, very clear today that the world has already changed. It's no longer a question of going, I don't see any path going back to the old world of moderation, stability, and unfortunately even the peace dividend we have we will no longer be able to enjoy. So the last 30 years is not what we are going back to. There will be no way to go behind the war in Europe, and there will be no way to go behind or to not see the consequences of the aggression between the US and China. But there is, so there is a certain irreversibility, which means we have a new world, which we need to understand. And the second thing which is irreversible, we already know that, that in terms of climate change, we already have a 1 degree warming. Maybe that's what we are feeling here, but it is irreversible. So the question is only how much further do we go? And all of these things that have already changed, and we know about them, do mean one thing. We need technology, we need innovation, we need research. So far, I think it is absolutely indisputable. Well, I hope it is quite indisputable what I've said. Now the question is, how do we get this technology? How do we get this innovation? And how do we share it? How do we collaborate? And this is the additional point I would like to put on the table. It is also a question of cross-border. So we are talking here about, in many cases, global commons, about public goods on the European but also on the global level. And how do you stimulate sufficient research into these global commons is the question. So there is a question of financing at the national level, but that is at least a question that national governments will have very much their eye on. Whereas at the supranational level, it is much, much more difficult. Let me give you an example. The example is when the Next Generation EU was negotiated, the first thing that fell by the way were the European Commons research financing, because that is nobody and everybody. And this is also true for a lot of what we are talking about, why it is so difficult to fund research, fundamental research, and fundamental research into the global commons privately and publicly. So what are examples? I wanted to give two examples of what can work, and one of them is the CEPR, but let me first start with another example. The CERN, the biggest super collider in the world, which was financed collectively by member countries before the EU, and which continues to be financed in a collaborative way. And the second example I want to give is the Center of Economic Policy. This is a pure network, c'est un réseau, which of more than 1,700 academic economists all over the world who really collaborate. They collaborate to bring together research and policy work. So one example I want to give, when the war in the Ukraine, Russian invasion of the Ukraine happened last year, a group of this CEPR came together in very, very short time and delivered a first Marshall Plan outline for Ukraine at a time when it was, March of last year. These are the kind of things that you can only do collaboratively. And that's where you need these kind of platforms, as the CEPR is one, and you need the ecosystems to work.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Laurent Saint-Martin, you're the CEO of Business France. You heard Béatrice Weber Di Mauro, and it was interesting because she said research is everybody's business and also nobody's business. Should we protect research? Should we keep it at home? Should we consider it as something to be protected, or is it better for researchers move to France or from France to Djibouti? Well, I will not talk about whatever is sacred, but do we need to protect research? The obvious answer is yes. And I believe that came out of all our speeches. Thank you for even inviting me. Let me give you the vision of a public institution which works with private institutions. And it's easier for me to talk about it because at one point I was a budget reporter on the law on research. So I know how I could see at the time how the cooperation between the public and the private sectors can bring a lot to research. So research has to attract people from all over the world, and obviously basic research, applied research, development, innovation are good tools for French competitiveness, for the attractiveness of France and its success internationally. And in fact, France has rather good results on the topic. We're the sixth economic power in terms of research spending. I tend to say that it's more research investment more than research spending, and I'm talking about both applied and basic research. Don't think that the economic world is not thinking about the basic research. A country can be attractive also when it has a good basic and fundamental research. It's very important to consider both aspects of research as two bricks of one same building. We are in the number 4 in the world in terms of patent registrations, and this is a good signal in terms of development for the public and private sectors. When you talk about being attractive, let me remind you that for the 4th year in a row, France has been the top European country in terms of foreign direct investments. And this is due to a large part to our ability to attract research and R&D projects. So this is a change that has been so for the past 7 years, and which is a considerable change. We work with the whole communes, all the areas of France, to make sure that international investors can go to the various clusters, and it works. Those of you who saw the Choose France Attractiveness Summit in Versailles recently, you were there, madam. So the Taiwan project concerning special batteries and cells, and they came because of the skills of French people. There was a major 500 million euros investment by Pfizer. It's due to the fact that they know France, and also they know we have talents. So France is well positioned. In fact, Ernst & Young consider us as champions of innovation and champions of attractiveness through innovation. So what should we do? We must not just continue being good. We must accelerate to be leaders. I read that Bruno Le Maire wants to make France the top economic European power by 2050. This will go through development in the public and private sectors. And let me say a few simple things. The research tax credit works. Do not change it. The cost of a French researcher without this would be 10 to 14 points higher than that of a German researcher. So we can lose this competitive advantage very quickly if we change the tools that are working. So first thing, let's not change what is working properly, and let's protect the research tax credit. And France 2030 should be used as a leverage. 10 silos or vertical elements of innovation with 54 billion of public investment plus the private investment. You can multiply the impact by 4. And so you can multiply R&D thanks to France 2030, France 2030. Apart from that, we have excellent clusters in France, excellent poles of excellence. We have university research poles like Saclay and many others. And many people abroad envy us. It's true that the issue of ranking, I'm not coming back to this, could be a possibility of improvement, but we already have quite a lot of talent. The last point is that we have to attract international talent. There's quite a lot of work to be done to find the tools, especially with a number of countries, export countries. How can we attract the talents from these countries and get them to come to France and participate in the collective effort? We still have a lot to do on that topic to reinforce the position of our country in terms of basic research, scientific research, and innovation for the industry and companies. Thank you.
Mood, je vous ai vu réagir. Vous avez...
Mohamed, Mouhoud, I saw you react when Laurent Saint-Martin said you shouldn't change the tax research tax credit. Yes, agreed. You shouldn't get rid of it, but you should modify it. 45% of it goes to services. We have to use it for deep tech, for transforming technologies, and I believe that it has to go to the right place. And I agree with you, it works, and we have to continue with it, but we have to modify it. We have to question, in a way, the cold feet that some investors seem to have in terms of research investments. You did say that there's more and more smoothness. You can have private sector doctorate. It's no longer, you no longer have the public sector always present, but you have, it doesn't seem that the deep techs, even though they were supported by the Loi Allègre, are going ahead as they should. When you assess things, you have quite a lot of issues at administrative levels, as far as the private funding stakeholders seems to have cold feet in this type of investment. They tend to prefer to invest in digital startup companies or digital platforms than in these deep techs. So there have been experiences abroad. I guess my colleague from CPR was rightly saying that it's a global problem, all the more globalized that we have the resources. There's elements like open innovation. I know, if I can mention my university, we do research sponsoring, and it works well because the large corporations who go for open innovation without waiting for short-term yield and looking at long-term yields are getting good results. So the issue of proper targeting is not yet solved in France if we want to be more efficient. I'm one of the first in France to have worked on the issue of industrial relocation. We have too much direct support, which are not useful. We need to focus resources on the transforming technologies, because to come back to what you said, the international economists make a distinction between the short and long advantages. The fleeting advantages, if you invest in them, are not sustainable. If you look at what the Germans do when they invest in blocks of and skills, longer term advantages, you can recover comparative advantages. So there is a real issue. We have to delve into this issue. We are not doing that badly, as the minister reminded us, but there's an issue of losses or absence of attractiveness of private groups in the area of transforming technologies.
Réagir, peut-être, Madame la Ministre.
Several of you wanted to react, Madam Minister. Yes, picking up on what was said, and I agree with this, but we often agree. I would like to insist on the issue of transforming technologies, and I would like to talk about the issue of training and attractiveness at the same time as investment. We talk about something being attractive, but it's not only an issue of attractive. You have to attract talents. You have research, but the other important point is training. We talked about doctorates. We work in the same area. I know that area. It's true that the companies that were mentioned earlier, like Cytec or others, or Leti, started with semiconductors, but in the whole of the industry, We need more at the 70th anniversary of NRT. Louis Gallois mentioned that. We are progressing, but we have to continue. France is a country of engineers, which is a good thing, but we also need doctorates. Why? Because this brings in this development of innovation towards transfer. And this is cultural. If you want to aim at deep techs, if you want to connect the basic and applied research, this academic world and this corporate world, and the more natural all this will be. And if we don't do things at a natural level by connecting all these cultures, which is why we put in the special programs in the universities, the more you do that and the more this transfer will take place naturally, and the more we'll have a continuity between basic research, applied research, and transfer to companies. And one last point, which hasn't been mentioned sufficiently, the word Europe. The European scale, especially for research, is a basic one, is a fundamental one. If you compare the investments of the US and China, the right scale is Europe. And careful when we invest at national level. France 2030 is very good and is a good thing, because it will direct research towards the market. But sometimes if you stay too much at the national level, you do not go and get back the money that we as a state invest in Europe. You don't get it back for our researchers. So we have to cooperate. We have to look for fundings for funds in Europe. We saw that in the various projects. Thank you very much. We have less than 10 minutes left. So a very quick word. I perfectly agree. I agree 200% with what you said about the projects, the transforming projects and the funds necessary from the private sector. We need to have the right ecosystem. If you talk about the electrical batteries that Mr. Saint-Martin mentioned, a whole ecosystem has been built with car producers committing to buy batteries, and this gives the right ecosystem. If you look at hydrogen, we're not there yet. There are major projects, support is coming in, but the whole equipment in the industrial chain necessary for these projects are coming up. It's coming. We'll have to fund research and development. And if you look at the nuclear sectors and the AMRs and SMRs, we have to work because we haven't got the fuel that we need. We haven't got everything we need upstream and downstream. So the more researchers we have with us and around us to understand things, the better it is and the easier it will be. Minister of Research in Djibouti, Nabil, your issue is to keep your researchers, to retain them, and to enable them to move around. Yes, we want to retain them because we invest a lot. I often say that French taxpayers pay for their researchers to go to Canada, and we have the same issue. Coming back to the history of companies in France, we know a lot about French history and French research. There seems to be a lack of trust between the world of research and the corporate world. And we have to get rid of these barriers. We have to get rid of them in Djibouti as well. We have a lot of investments in the harbor of Djibouti via private investment. But at the same time, we can see that companies gain a lot because they can find brains at a lesser cost. And a company cannot develop if they haven't got the right research, which is what we're trying to support in Djibouti. In Djibouti, we have another issue. It must have a quick impact on populations because we have huge needs. And this is a real need. It must impact the population. We have huge priorities in terms of health, water, energy. So we must do this work, but let's not forget innovating because otherwise Africa will lose its technology. We must work on innovation. Fundamental basic research cannot be done on our own. We have to work with the Western countries, so to say, that have this capacity through doctorate programs and master's programs. Beatrice Weber Di Mauro, you made a call to Europe. You also told Sylvie Retailleau that we should not forget the European dimension. Yes, absolutely. The European dimension is a reality. That's the piece of good news, and clearly it should even be more important in terms of funding and at all levels, national level, European level. The issue of the future is that there's going to be more and more pressure on state budgets because we'll have to fund more and more sectors and elements while having reduced resources. There will be more competition between nations. We have seen the first example now between the US and Europe with the IOA. Which leads me to an issue of industrialization. Who can maintain the industry? And this is going to exert pressure on budget as well, on the budget of research as well. So what is the solution if you need, do we need more research with less resources? We need to be more efficient in this case. And this is the specialty of economists. And we need research in social sciences.
Resources is particularly important in the future in this field.
Merci beaucoup. Béatrice.
Thank you very much, Béatrice Weber Di Mauro. Laurent Saint-Martin. You have time for a few last words. Do we have to call upon the private sector even more and use the lever of the private sector? Yes, and I agree, and I will pick up what the minister said. There's still a mistrust between public research and the world and the corporate world, and this must be overcome. We're honestly heading in the right direction. I used to manage a SAT a few years ago, and I saw a true cultural revolution in our country as concerns the ability we have to give more value to research for companies. But we need a clear partnership between private and public research and the corporate world. Let me finish with a word on privatism investment. Obviously, the question on private equity and private venture is an issue. In France, we know it, and we see some true great research and golden nuggets, so to say, because of that. But there is still a great competition between the great blocks of technology and innovation. For France 2030, we do not necessarily need to have a French answer. We will have to have a Europe at the top. We need a fund or funds of venture funds for private equity in order to go above and beyond what we can do at present in this so-called black hole that we have from 70 million euros, let's say. Thank you very much, Laurence Saint-Martin, the head of Business France. Thank you all for taking part in this discussion. Should we protect research for the future? Thank you.